Olá, sejam muito bem-vindos a mais uma live exclusivíssima do Brasil Fantasy Football, BRFF, o seu canal de fantasy no Brasil, no YouTube, nas redes sociais, em todo lugar. Eu sou o André Amaral e hoje temos o privilégio de receber pela segunda vez um dos maiores nomes da indústria do fantasy football em todo o planeta. Ele que já trabalhou na NFL Network, atualmente está no Yahoo e possui como principal marca e conceito o Reception Perception, metodologia de análise de wide receivers que isola o desempenho deles em relação a todos os outros fatores do jogo, inclusive a qualidade dos quarterbacks, e hoje está hospedado num site próprio, o qual vale cada centavo da assinatura. É o volume 2 de Matt Harmon no Brasil, senhoras e senhores, já deixando claro que infelizmente, a nossa equipe está mais atribulada do que em outras oportunidades e, por isso, não será possível que a gente realize a legenda da live para exibições futuras. Eu vou passar alguns recados em português e depois faremos a dinâmica com o match toda em inglês para não ficar muito travado, beleza, galera? Mas fica com a gente, mesmo se o seu inglês não for totalmente fluente, porque é certo que o conteúdo de hoje vale muito a pena. So, hi, Matt. Thank you so much for being here with us for the second year in a row. It's our huge honor and pleasure to welcome you to our show once again, as you are a huge inspiration for all of the fantasy football community in Brazil, who can now definitely call you a friend, even though you didn't invite us to the wedding. Jokes aside, welcome back, and please start off by telling us, how is the married life treating you this far?
Yeah, appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, and definitely, look, we're all friends here, but to anybody that has planned a wedding before, you got to make some tough cuts, right? You can't have everybody showing up at that thing, especially if you've got a lot of friends, like all you guys and everything. So you can't have everybody show up. You're really gonna run the bill up. But married life has been great. I'm very lucky. My wife is incredible. She's so supportive, and especially because for me, I'm like the complicated one in the relationship, right? Because I've got this crazy job in season, every week, the NFL seasons, punching you in the face. You're making content, shows, podcasts, articles every day is something, really. There's no way I'm getting married in the fall, right? There's no way I'm getting married in even in the winter, even. And honestly, then I'm the idiot that has decided to make my life more complicated in the summer by listen, I've got to chart all these receivers, got to put up perception stats. So really, it was like we had 1 month to get married. It was May.
Oh, wow.
We did it. It was incredible. It was awesome. The ceremony was great. The venue was great. My buddy James Coe, who's the co-owner of Reception Perception, actually officiated the wedding. So it was incredible. All of our friends and family were there. It was great. I'm very happy to have pulled off a great event like that. But fellas and everybody else out there, I'm also happy that it's over because not having to think about the wedding, not having to think about planning the wedding, that feels pretty nice too. But I appreciate you guys having me for another year. It's always great to talk with you guys.
Nice, that's awesome, Matt. As a married man for the last 6 years, I know how you feel, and the whole ceremony must have been awesome. James is a really nice guy, so yeah, congratulations on the wedding.
Thank
you. Before we start with the fantasy football questions, I'll just send some messages in Portuguese and introduce my fellow colleague here so they can say his greetings to you and those watching us, okay? Beleza, então galera, convidar vocês a participar com perguntas, comentários, cornetadas, o que vocês quiserem. Nosso Lord Derek aqui vai fazer a tradução simultânea para quem quiser mandar pergunta em português. Fiquem à vontade para escrever na língua que vocês quiserem, porque o Derek manda muito em todas elas. Então, curtam o vídeo, acionem o sininho e se inscrevam no canal. Sigam a gente lá nos agregadores de podcast e deixem a avaliação de 5 estrelas, onde isso é possível. Fica também o convite para vocês assinarem o BRFF pelo site. Tem as opções de plano anual, semestral e por temporada, com os novos preços mais acessíveis aí nesse ano de 2022, sendo que em todos eles já vem incluído o Draft Guide dos nossos presidas Rui Maurício e Caio Ribeiro. Agora eu vou apresentar o meu colega mais do que nobre aqui, Derek Bissigini, novamente aqui comigo para me ajudar. Quero que você dê o seu recado inicial para a galera e seu oi aí para o Matt também. Boa noite, Derek.
Perfeito, boa noite pessoal, tudo bom? Muito obrigado por estarem aqui com a gente novamente, né? Repetindo mais um ano. Thank you very much, Matt, to be with us today once again, and with this weird accent. So we hope we can talk a lot about the wide receivers. That we have a few questions here and there, and also get a few questions from the audience, a few questions that they have, a few curiosities that you could show us, and things like that. So, welcome again.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it. It's gonna be fun.
Okay, so let's get started. Let me just get my question here. Yeah, there's no way to start if not by talking about wide receivers. There are a lot of names we want to talk about, and not only about receivers, but we feel it's important for our audience to know, especially those who didn't have a chance to watch our show with you last year, Matt, what your method consists of. So what is reception perception? How did you come up with the idea? And why is it such a valuable tool both for fantasy players and for NFL fans in general?
Yeah, so appreciate the question. It's always good to kind of clarify that right off the top. And basically, what reception perception is, I guess let me actually start with why I thought I thought it was a good idea to do, and what kind of came up with why the idea kind of sparked in my head, which is basically my biggest question about football when I set out to kind of start to make a career in this, and even before that, really, like in the very beginning stages, for me, it was, what are wide receivers doing, when they run off the screen on Sunday, right? When we're watching games that, it's all focused on watching the ball, where the quarterback, behind the offensive line, to get to the running back, whatever. But we all know as fans of the game that wide receiver is so inherent on other outside variables to accrue production, right? Obviously you need a good quarterback to get you the ball, but there's even more that goes into it than that, right? Like the offensive line's got to protect the quarterback. Everybody is kind of playing in different systems. Everybody's playing in different roles. That was a big thing for me back in the day, which was, for me, like kind of my formative years really becoming obsessed, with football. It was that like Patriots. I mean, I'm not a Patriots fan. I've never been a Patriots fan, but like I always will never forget like that first year where Randy Moss and Wes Welker came to the Patriots, and it was, they were both having great seasons. Obviously, Randy Moss was breaking touchdown records with Tom Brady, but they were both having great seasons. But man, those two guys couldn't be playing like any different position, right? Like they might as well be playing different positions, even though they're both WR on the depth chart. So that idea always kind of stuck with me too, is like, there's got to be a way to differentiate between a Randy Moss style of wide receiver and a Wes Welker style of receiver. And, so I started back in 2013, sort of testing the early results of reception perception. And basically what I do is I go in over an 8-game sample for NFL players and college players and chart every single route that they run in that 8 games, where they line up on every snap, how often they run each route type, how often they get open versus man zone press coverage, how often they get open against each route type as well. And basically the goal is to try to isolate wide receiver play from all of those outside variables, because there really is no stat, whether it's yards, targets, catches, anything like that. It all brings in the variable of the quarterback. Even in like a great metric like yards per route run, well, it's the yards per route run. The yard, you need the quarterback to get you the yard, right? So I think reception perception is, when it started, it was the only thing. I think there's been a lot of other great things that have come out as well, but it was the only thing to really isolate wide receivers from that outside variable and really just try to tell you how good this individual player is, which I think obviously is important for fantasy. And it's even more important just to be a smart NFL fan, to see what type of wide receivers these guys are and really how good they are in that specific role.
Awesome.
Perfect. So let's then dive into some reception players profiles. Actually, you will start with this one, the one that you like a lot, that you even called a Bud Light version of Cooper Cup. So his name is Amon Brown. That just destroyed last year in the final games, and he's quite a polarizing player, because when he exploded last year, we had a few guys out of the game. That was D'Andre Swift and also TJ Hawkinson. So they are the basically the 1 and 2 the wide receivers of the Lions. So the question is, do you think that St. Brown, with a healthy Swift and a healthy TJ, plus the addition of Jameson Williamson during draft, and also DJ Shark via free agency. Can everybody coexist in that offense? And also, how would you project Goff for next year? So he got really nice weapons, so probably he would need to show up a little bit more than the previous years.
Yeah, I think that's a great guy to start with. And you said at the top he's a polarizing player, and like this idea that he's polarizing seems so crazy to me because it starts kind of with a straw man argument, right? Which is that everybody that is kind of out on Amon-Ra St. Brown will tell you, well, he's not going to do what he did to end last year. Well, no kidding, right? Like everybody knows he's not going to do that. And nobody, even the folks that are in on Amon-Ra St. Brown, is that we're not asking you to believe that he's going to do that. Like nobody is projecting him for a 30+% target share like he held in the final month of the season. Nobody's projecting him to average 11 targets per game. If people did expect that, he'd be going in the first 2 or 3 rounds. He's not going in the first 2 or 3 rounds. So I think what you look at from what he did last year is that was a show that he's a really, really good player. Like you can take out environment, and you could take out the fact that he was playing with a bunch of goofball receivers, DJ Hawkinson banged up, DeAndre Swift in and out of the lineup. If you're good, you're going to get the ball a ton, and they're going to design a role for you regardless of who else is in that offense. So to me, it doesn't really matter. I think that target competition, what really matters is that when you look at the final 8 weeks of the season, really after the Lions got off their bye week, they had crafted a specific role for him. That Bud Light Cooper Kupp role that started before all of these other guys got hurt. And what I mean by that, right? Like I actually said the Bud Light Cooper Kupp thing before he got drafted by the Lions, obviously a team with the former Rams front office guy as their GM, the former Rams quarterback and Jared Goff. I think the synergy, they saw that. I saw that, I think it makes a lot of sense there, right? Because he's this guy just like Cooper Kupp, who's going to run a ton of his routes against zone coverage. 67% of his routes came against zone coverage in his reception perception sample. And he posted a really, really nice 80.4% success rate. Like he's able to beat that zone coverage underneath. He's not going to be, an outside the numbers vertical receiver. He's going to be a guy that crushes you over the middle against zone coverage. It really just is. I want to buy into that archetype of player. I really want to buy into a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown. And yeah, of course, like he's going to maybe have a 22% target share, but where he's going in drafts, that's pretty good enough for me. I expect him to lead the team in targets. I expect him to lead the team in catches. And frankly, like guys, of course we want to talk about TJ Hawkinson coming back. TJ Hawkinson's never had a stretch in his career, his couple-year career here, like Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I think the Lions are really interesting. I think the fact that they're getting all these good players back can be, good for the entire offensive ecosystem. Jameson Williams really is the key because you just look back at those Rams offenses with Jared Goff. They were always best when they had a vertical seam stretcher. Brandon Cooks in 2018, really comes out there. He was kind of a missing piece for that offense. And, they really, really missed a player like that in Goff's final season with the Rams. I don't think Jared Goff is the answer for the Lions. I'm sure you guys probably don't either, but he's good enough to like feed players for fantasy in a good situation. And I think this is actually a sneaky good situation with the Lions right now.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah. Goff makes for a particularly interesting player in super flex leagues, right?
Exactly. Because he's really slept on, after all these weapons and the whole situation that you talked about. And also, just a parenthesis here, I quite enjoyed the Lions' last drafts because they are starting a few positions there. Other team that also, in my opinion, did a great job in this draft is the Jets. So I think in the near future, of like 3 to 4 years, they'll probably start getting way better than they are today, of course. So
maybe some positive campaigns after years and years of negative ones, right? Yeah. So Matt, I'm particularly obsessed with Drake London, and I think. Yeah, I think he will smash in the league from day one. Your prospect profile on him gave me even more encouragement as it dismisses a lot of the narrative that he's just a contested catch guy and can't separate from defenders. Please elaborate on that and tell us how you think he will perform as a fantasy asset, both in redraft and in Dynasty, please.
Yeah, big Drake London fan. You know, I'd heard the narrative that he couldn't separate or whatever coming into watching him, and I just didn't find that to be true. Like, is he a Devontae Smith type of separator from last year, an Elijah Moore type of separator from that previous draft class? No. Is he a separator like a Chris Olave or Garrett Wilson? Probably not. But I do think he can get open more than good enough, right? Like his success rate versus zone coverage, really high, really nice 72% success rate versus man coverage. That's more than good enough for a big receiver. You know, that's higher than guys like Mike Williams that we've seen before coming to the NFL. And I like Mike Williams as a player, but I'm just talking like, you know, from a top 10 receiver pick perspective, Drake London is a better separator than those guys. He really reminds me of like a little bit of throwback comparison here. It feels crazy to say that. It makes me feel old to say Brandon Marshall is a throwback comparison, yeah. right? It feels like we're getting up there, guys. We're getting up there. But Brandon Marshall, very similar player to a Drake London. You know, I also think there are some shades of like a Michael Thomas type of player too, a guy who can really get open on those slants and curl routes, you know, dig routes as well, really work that middle of the field. You know, Michael Thomas has been a perimeter receiver, but I also think he would thrive as like a big slot. That's what a lot of people thought he was going to be coming into the NFL. I think that Drake London would be really interesting as a big slot receiver. I can't wait to see, actually. I mean, I'm not looking forward to Falcons games, but I can't wait to see where Kyle Pitts lines up, Drake London lines up. You know, they've got Brian Edwards there too, who's more of a pure X receiver. They've got also, you know, Cordero Patterson, who's like Mr. Positional Versatility. So there's a lot of potential here for this Falcons offense to be creative. I don't know how great they're going to be, but I don't mind taking Drake London once you get to like your wide receiver 4, late wide receiver 3 in redraft this year. And I did have him as the highest ranked prospect in this year's class, and he's my number 1 rookie for Dynasty from this year.
Nice. Now, Derek will pick some questions from the audience.
Right. The first one is from Fantasy Futebolista, our friend Guilherme Giannis. He asked regarding the zero RB or hero RB, depending on which name you came from, like the most. What do you think about this strategy? And especially for 2022, in this year, of course, comparing to 21, just in other words, last year. So, how do you see this whole strategy? Do you agree? Do you hate? What are your feelings regarding that?
Yeah, so I definitely have retired from the zero RB wars. Not interested in arguing with folks on Twitter about zero RB or anything like that. I'll leave that to the hardcore zero RB bros. But I do think that, you know, mixing in, I think the part that always really stuck out to me with zero RB and why I liked parts of it as a strategy, you know, dating back to like my time in NFL Network, you know, Michael Fabiano and I used to argue about this all the time. That's why I'm like, I'm not arguing about this anymore. But you know, the part that always really made sense to me and I really liked about the strategy is that it's in the inherent volatility of the running back position, because we know that chaos rules the NFL, and chaos always seems to hit the running back position. That's the whole Sean Siegel's whole original idea, was trying to be anti-fragile with your teams, and running back is an extremely fragile position. We know that not only, again, it's very inherent, you know, like we talk about the wide receivers, there's some things you need to go right in order to produce as a running back, but they get injured at a high rate. There is some game script volatility with a lot of these guys too. So kind of embracing that chaos and leaning into ways where that chaos can help you out a little, like you can benefit from that chaos. I think that's really smart. I do really like the idea of going like the hero RB or like anchor RB idea, where you take one really good running back and then you just start loading up on, I think, you know, quarterbacks are back, right? Like these guys like Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson, I really want to draft them this year. Kyler Murray makes a ton of sense to me. Jalen Hurts even is really appealing. Loading up on a really good quarterback like that and then hammering the wide receiver position. Maybe you find a tight end of value that you like. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, because we know that you can find replaceable production off the waiver wire, stuff like that later on in your drafts if you hit the right running back. So I think that it makes sense from a structural perspective, especially depending on where the board falls. Like, I mean, I'm not going to do 0 RB if I get one of the first 2 picks. Like I'm taking Jonathan Taylor or Christian McCaffrey. You know, you get back to the middle of the first round though. I don't know about you guys, but this year, first round kind of stinks. Not a fan of like a ton of the running backs that are going to go in the first round. So definitely, I think, you know, taking a Cooper Kupp or a Justin Jefferson early, and then maybe leaning a little more wide receiver heavy. I think that's fine to me this year. That really, I think, will kind of dictate maybe your strategic approach based on where you go in the draft, and then kind of what happens before you.
Yeah, and also there are some intriguing names in the so-called running back dead zone, like Breece Hall,
Yes.
Travis Etienne, someone that I like. And I took a sneak peek at your roster in the Scott Fishbowl, Matt, and I got surprised that you got 2 running backs in the early rounds, just 1 wide receiver. So we have to adapt to all the things, and Scott Fishbowl is a whole different animal, right?
My wide receivers are weird this year, man, and none of them are like, you know, necessarily, you know, my guys or whatever. You know, I'm kind of iffy on Gabe Davis. I drafted Gabe Davis and Scott Fishbowl because it just felt right. Somebody took Allen Robinson right before me, so I had to take Mike Williams there. So there's been a little bit of like give and take in the Scott Fishbowl. I think I've ended up with a receiver core that, you know, people probably wouldn't have expected, but I'm pretty happy with it. The only thing I'm irritated about is that I meant to draft Tyler Boyd in the 12th round, and I was watching a show and like drafting with one eye, and I ended up taking Robbie Anderson. And I was like, all right, well, that's whatever. It's on.
It happens.
Some was the same. No.
Everybody misclicks, yeah. And so passing on to another question here, I have to give a little context, because this guy right here is a great friend of mine, and he's a Raiders fan. But it's interesting because you have Davante Adams, I think, a little bit lower than the consensus, but he's asking you who will be Fantasy MVP and why Davante Adams.
See, this is tough because I like Davante Adams this year, but he's one of these first round picks where I'm a little hesitant. I do have Davante Adams in wide receiver 7 in my tiers cheat sheet that just launched on receptionperception.com. I have Mike Evans and CeeDee Lamb ahead of him, and it's not like a anti-Davante Adams thing. I'd really just want to green light those guys as guys that I'm very excited about this year, and I think have really high ceilings. I think Davante Adams obviously has a really high ceiling as well because he's the best receiver in football. So it pains me from a moral standpoint to have him at wide receiver 7 almost. However, obviously we know he's getting a quarterback downgrade. That's just not a point to argue. It's just a fact. Aaron Rodgers is better than Derek Carr, but I think you could also argue kind of out of both sides of your mouth about how good this ecosystem is for Davante Adams. Because on the one hand, there's going to be more target competition. Like Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller are legit players. Renfrow just fits so perfectly in that slot receiver position, crushes zone coverage. But I think he's a little bit more than kind of your what I call these like pop gun slot receivers, like Cole Beasley or Jamison Crowder, like those guys. Like he can get off press coverage a little bit. He's not extremely limited in that way. So Renfrow, I think, can play in that like Julian Edelman flanker slot receiver role that you would think was going to come in this offense with Josh McDaniels, and Darren Waller is a legit player too. So I think there's 3 guys that you could kind of pencil in for 100+ targets this year. So is Adams going to have that same dominant target share, 30+% that he's had with the Packers? Probably not, but there's also a chance. I think if you want to believe in Davante Adams this year, you have to believe that the Raiders under Josh McDaniels are going to run a really fast-paced offense. They're going to push for one of the league leads in plays and pass attempts and stuff like that. You know, sort of those old Tom Brady offenses from like 2000. We're talking about like 2008, 2000 or 2007 to, like 2011, 2012. That era of Tom Brady offense is not really what they've been running the last 3 years, the final year of Brady, the first year with Cam Newton, and then Mac Jones's rookie year, because McDaniels really slowed down the pace, upped the rushing attempts. You got to kind of believe that they're going to get back to that. And I think that's possible. I'm not 100% bought in, which is kind of where I sit. Like I have him at wide receiver 7 and, sort of, I'm okay drafting him in the second round, but I'm not expecting the same sort of thing that we've seen in Green Bay, if that makes sense.
Perfect. So, I believe okay. So I'm not freezed. I was like, did I freeze or something like that? No.
No, we're here.
You're all good.
Yeah.
So let's go with another questions. One of the biggest debates this fantasy season has been about Denver wide receivers after the arrival of Russell Wilson, who in the last 2 years has produced 2 top 20 wide receivers while playing a run-heavy offense. Your ranks showed you that you seem to be with the majority that trust more in Cortland Sutton, like me, than Jerry Jeudy. Why is that, and how big do you think the gap between them is, in fact? And why do you prefer more Sutton than Jeudy?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a little higher on Cortland Sutton than I guess I thought I'd be. I know we got a Broncos shirt here or jersey on the show here, so I'm gonna really choose my words carefully.
But here I'm just giving homage to Demaryius Thomas. I'm a Bears fan actually, but
all right, good.
Let's
all right,
not
well then
talk
I
about
can
it.
speak.
Yeah,
then I can speak freely.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. We definitely don't have to talk about the Bears. That's fine.
No.
I think with these Denver receivers, I have gone back and forth about from like a pure player ability. Who do I like better? Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton, because I think that neither one of these guys had their best seasons last year. I think again, the goal of reception perception is to isolate them from quarterback play. And Cortland Sutton just completely disappeared from a statistical standpoint when Jerry Jeudy got back in the lineup. And I think some of that shows up in his reception perception. Now, at the same time, I have done some work recently. I'm hoping to put an article on the website that shows that we can expect guys to perform below their career expectations in their first year off of an ACL from, again, like a reception perception standpoint, pure individual play. Guys like Allen Robinson, Cooper Kupp. There have been other examples when they've torn their ACL, they've suffered from like a success rate versus man coverage perspective in their first year back. So I think that could explain why we saw a drop off from Cortland Sutton last year. And maybe he's back and more close to that 2019 form where I thought he was really, really taking some steps as an individual receiver. So I do think right now he's the better player. I don't really love drafting him necessarily where he's going because I still think there's a chance I could see myself moving Jeudy up the rankings as the summer goes on, because the thing I want to see out of Jeudy is he going to play in 3 receiver sets? Is he going to play, or is 2 wide receiver sets? Is he going to be the outside flanker receiver? I think that would make much more sense from his skill set standpoint, because just when you project him, like, he's not been a guy that's been involved in the red zone at all. They've kind of made him like a low A-dot slot receiver. I think that this staff hopefully can use him a little more creatively. So I haven't really been all that gassed up about drafting any Broncos players. So I'm thinking I need to revisit the ranks a little bit based on kind of my hesitance with these guys. Because I'm just not really sure that I see any of them absolutely crushing their ADPs this year. I could see Cortland Sutton being that guy, but if Jerry Jeudy takes another step, he could really, stand out here. So, and Tim Patrick's a guy that I'm a little bit ahead of consensus on because he's ranked as like wide receiver 59 in industry consensus. Like I've got him a little bit higher than that because I think he's going to be a player who commands a little bit of targets too. I just want to see what his role is going to be as well. And then the tight ends are there too. So there's a lot. Honestly, there's a lot of stuff going on in Denver. And Russ is a guy that, like you said, he supported 2 top 20 receivers. But in that Seahawks offense, that was it. It was Lockett and it was DK and it was really nothing else. Denver's pretty different because they could be a team that really spreads it around a lot further down the depth chart.
Yeah. Perfect. So, getting the hook regarding Seattle, Vitor asked, can we still trust DK Metcalf this year, even without Russell? So, obviously, we have a really bad downgrade from Russ to Locke. So how do you see him? Would you still draft him? Would you rather pass him for a running back, a tight end, or other wide receiver in this range?
Yeah, man, this could be really rough in Seattle.
Yeah.
I mean, Drew Lock and Geno Smith, like that's not a serious quarterback room. You know what I mean? Like that's what is that, right? Like Geno Smith, we know who Geno Smith is. We know who Drew Lock is. There's not a lot of upside there. I mean, again, the good thing about Seattle, when you just project these guys out, Lockett and Metcalf, they're going to get a lot of targets because they're really the only two guys in town. Like Noah Fant, they brought in. Noah Fant's a pretty legit player, but again, further down the wide receiver depth chart, there's not a lot going on there. So I would, if I had to pick a Seattle receiver, I'd much rather draft Tyler Lockett at his ADP than DK Metcalf at his ADP, because I don't think the gap between these two guys as players is very large. I mean, over the last few years, it's been kind of neck and neck. Lockett's a really good player, really good big play receiver. Like, he's going to give you a lot of spiked weeks, I think, still. So, and he goes like 4 rounds after DK Metcalf, which just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So, if I got to draft a Seahawks receiver, and I'm not like gassed up to invest in this ecosystem at all, but if I got to draft one, I would draft Tyler Lockett at his ADP over DK Metcalf at his higher ADP.
Yeah, and after this more recent news, do you think is there any chance that we see Jimmy Garoppolo in a divisional rival in Seattle, or maybe just if he gets released?
Yeah, he's going to have to get cut, I feel like, because the 49ers, what's the incentive to help out, a division rival that, look, if you plopped a good quarterback on this team, they have holes, but there's still some life there. Pete Carroll's changing around the defense for the first time in forever. He's brought in a lot more of the, like Sean Desai, some from the Bears, so like a more of a Fangio style disciple. That's really, counterintuitive, like counter to what the Seahawks have run all this year. So they're certainly rebuilding in some areas, but they added it to their offensive line in the draft. They added another running back in the draft. Like, they've got players there. If you plop a decent quarterback there, and Garoppolo's a decent quarterback, he's not anybody's franchise answer. I think we know that, but that would make the Seahawks like to potentially to go from a stomping mat in the division, like, hey, San Francisco's going to go in there and beat them up every 2 times a year. We're going to just roll through these guys, to like, okay, now they're feisty. They've got to have a guy that they used to play. I just don't see why they're incentivized to trade him there. He's going to have to get cut, which, I mean, guys, he might have to get cut, because who's trading for him at this point? Who's giving up another thing too, Jimmy is who Jimmy is. Like, I think at his best, he's a fine guy that can keep the ship afloat, can run an offense pretty well, but guy is barely thrown all summer. He's making a lot of money. So I don't know. I feel like the 49ers are going to have to sort of like take their medicine here. I think the whole shoulder thing just really screwed up the timeline for them. And it just really messed up the plans, but yeah, I just don't see like a legit trading spot for Jimmy at this point.
Yeah. We have talked about this subject quite a bit, but this one is plain and simple, Matt. Which wide receivers, I think, like Davante Adams, you do not like at their current ADP?
Yeah, we talked about the Denver guys. I think that those are, 2 examples, especially like, I don't want to get him too steamed up at certain points. I love this player, but Jalen Waddle at his ADP makes me a little nervous. And I guess you could group Tyreek Hill in there too, because I think Jalen Waddle is really great. Obviously, Tyreek Hill is one of the best receivers in the league. But there's a lot of questions about this offense. Number one, we know that we don't know how good the quarterback is. We don't know if Tua can, really like stretch the defense vertically. He's also not quite like, I know people think like, oh, Mike McDaniel, that 49ers offense, they ramped it up to the point that people like Jimmy Garoppolo got them to the Super Bowl. Jimmy and Tua are different quarterbacks. Like, Jimmy's not going to, God love him, he'll rifle that ball down the, into zone coverage over the middle of the field. Like, he'll throw it into the teeth of the defense. Tua doesn't really like to do that. So it's not like a 1-for-1 there. Also, how they're probably going to be pretty run heavy. This is not going to be a team that's like top 10 in pass attempts. And, there's a chance that Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill just dominate the target share here. I think there's a chance. And that's really what you need though. But they don't have, they're not like the Raiders, where at least when you look at the Raiders, there's 3 guys that should command targets there. Renfro, Adams, Waller, and then, it's like DeMarcus Robinson and Keelan Cole down the depth chart, not real like target earners. There's some decent players still there in Miami. They bring in Cedric Wilson as a free agent. They still have Mike Gesicki. Chase Edmonds catches pass out of the backfield. So I don't know. I've been a little shy on the Dolphins receivers at their ADP because there's some unknown. And then again, love this player, and I hate to ever say anything bad about him, but I just can't draft Chris Godwin this year. he's gonna miss a few games to start the year. I just mentioned that, like, we can expect a drop off from players coming off a torn ACL, and depending on where you look at, like from an ADP perspective, he's still going as like almost like a top 30 wide receiver, top 35 wide receiver. He might give you straight nothing for the first 4 weeks of the season. That's a lot to ask. That's a lot to ask to just take a 0 or potentially for the first month of the season. They really don't have any incentive to rush him back, right? Because they're more so thinking about December and January than they are September and October.
Yeah, in that division especially, right? The NFC South.
Oh, yeah. I mean, God, what a joke.
Yeah. So moving on, we know you really like second-year receivers, Matt, being drafted in the middle rounds, such as Rashad Bateman and Elijah Moore. But I'm curious to know what you think about someone that's being drafted way before them, way after them, showed flashes of being a very dangerous weapon in the open field, although far from being prolific as a route runner or separator, and has an intriguing opportunity with an open wide receiver depth chart and a new coaching staff in town, Kadarius Toney. Do you think he has a shot of becoming the number one receiver on the Giants? And how do you see the hierarchy between him, Golladay, Shepard, Wandale Robinson, all that plethora of names in New York?
Yeah, Shepard's tough. I mean, he tore his Achilles so late in the year. I wouldn't expect him to play in week 1. And then, you've got Wandale Robinson as a pure slot receiver. I wasn't the biggest Robinson fan, but I think he could be kind of like an Isaiah McKenzie type of player from them if you want to think about Brian Daboll's Bills offense. And that's really the key of this whole thing, right? Like, when you do your projections and you weigh like Brian Daboll's offense versus what Jason Garrett was putting on the field the last couple of years, that's like going from the outhouse to the penthouse right there. The Giants players are going to experience a lot of growth there from a pass volume perspective, a play volume perspective. So I think these guys have to get a bump. Toney, you mentioned it. I've got questions about him as a route runner. I've got questions about him as like a guy who can win against man press coverage routinely. At the same time, though, did show some good signals as like a success rate versus zone player and is just so gifted in the open field. The good part about Toney is that you don't have to draft him very high. He's an industry consensus ranked wide receiver 47 right now. I'm not a big like Kadarius Toney fan or anything, but I've got him at wide receiver 42. Like, that's fine, because I think at this point, then all of the risk is baked in with Toney, that he's obviously, let's just call him an interesting fella. He's an interesting guy. So that risk is baked in. I think the risk that about some of his ability is baked in. And if this Giants offense takes a step where they run more plays and they're faster paced, I think some of that upside is not baked into his current ADP or his current ranking. And just one thing on Kenny Golladay too. I thought, like, if Kenny Golladay looked pretty good in reception perception, despite the bad, statistics, no touchdowns, all that stuff, I would have been like, okay, I'm going to buy more in on Kenny Golladay than Kadarius Toney. But he was so bad last year, was Kenny Golladay. I mean, just not getting open, just nothing there. So if I'm betting on a Giants receiver, I've got Kadarius Toney a good bit ahead of ADP and not Kenny Golladay.
Nice.
Perfect. Talking about another wide receiver that you drafted in Scott Fishball. What are your thoughts? You just said a little bit, but I'd like to bring some more in-depth thing regarding Gabriel Davis. Because
wouldn't be a fantasy football show if we didn't talk about Gabe Davis, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, Davis is the name of the game.
Because this is the question that everybody is asking. His value, his ADP is really high, and mostly because of the game against Chiefs in the Jesus Christ, in the offseason, in the playoffs. Yeah, Jesus, in the playoffs, that he destroyed everything. But when you look at the season itself, he starts to show just in the very end of the season. He was like a wide receiver 3, 4, or something like that. So, which Gabriel Davis we are buying in? The one that explode in the explode, or the one that's just took a long time to just do anything?
Yeah, I've said that I'm really interested what happens when Gabe Davis, where he gets drafted when like the normal folks start to draft in August and September. Because listen, if you're drafting right now, if you're drafting on underdog, you're doing best ball drafts, you're not normal. And we love you for that because you're keeping the lights on, right? But you're not normal. Okay. Yeah, we love you for that. But 99% of the fantasy football population is not drafting right now. They'll be drafting in August and September. And I'm curious where his ADP lands there because he has gotten really steamed up in best ball drafts. And I understand that because there's a lot of like stacking, this, spike week, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But for me, I've got him at wide receiver 28. I think that represents kind of like a centrist opinion on Gabe Davis because I was on the Established to Run podcast with Evan Silva and Adam Levitan, and Evan really said it great, which is it's going to be tough for him to fail in this role. He has to be really, 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 really bad to fail. I think like outright be a complete useless player in fantasy football. And I don't think he's that bad. I mean, he's not like when you look at him in reception perception, he's around the 33rd percentile in success rate versus man coverage, 36th percentile in success rate versus zone coverage. That is obviously not great, but it's not like, Devin Funchess or Kelvin Benjamin, these guys who sorry, Panthers. The legends, Marquise Lee, some of these like all-time rough players in reception perception history. No, it's not quite that bad. He actually profiles in RP pretty similar to like a Devontae Parker type of player. I think Parker at his best was an average starting receiver. I think probably at best, Gabe Davis is an average starting receiver because as you said, there's been some volatility there. As great as his playoff game was, which by the way, you don't score 4 touchdowns in a playoff game and go over 200 yards without one, having a great game and having the defense screw it up a lot on the other side. It just doesn't happen that way. However, as great as that game was, his regular season finale, I believe against the New York Jets or Miami Dolphins, one of those two teams, he was terrible in that game. He couldn't get open. He couldn't win contested passes, and that was not that far before, right? So like, did he take a massive step from a couple of weeks? No, I think he's just an inconsistent player. Maybe he takes another step in year 3 and he's a more level guy. I think that's reasonable. So I kind of want to come down on the middle here with Gabe Davis, because if he's a Devontae Parker type of talent in this situation, that's really good. But I don't want to start thinking he's going to be like a top 15, top 17 fantasy receiver. I think that's getting a little aggressive. There's obviously a great ceiling there. And for me, I want to draft a lot of Stephon Diggs this year. That is for sure. I want to draft a lot of Stephon Diggs in the first round.
Yeah, we'll talk about him just a little bit. But speaking of open wide receiver depth charts, what do you think will come up from the main vacancies that the offseason brought us? Aaron Rodgers and Patrick Mahomes no longer have Davante Adams and Tyreek Hill. So what are your bets regarding the target distribution on those teams? Travis Kelce and Aaron Jones seem to be the major beneficiaries for fantasy football. But I'm curious to know who you trust more between the wide receivers on those teams, considering they don't have a super established veteran, and after both of them have drafted one in the second round.
Yeah, we'll start with Green Bay. I've got no freaking clue. I think this could be a offense where, and this is kind of how I have it projected, nobody goes over 1,000 yards, but everybody's somewhere between like 500 and 800 yards. When you look like between, Aaron Jones as a receiver, I like that you brought him up. I'm ahead of consensus on Aaron Jones from a running back standpoint. But I could see guys like Allen Lazard, Randall Cobb, Christian Watson when he picks it up, Sammy Watkins if he makes the team, Robert Tonyan. I think all of these guys could be between, like I said, 500, 700 yards, but nobody really goes over 900. I could see that being the situation there. Kansas City, I think, is a little more interesting because I could see a league winner coming out of this group. Because number one, I think the Packers are going to run like kind of an old school run heavy offense, but Chiefs ain't doing that, man. They're going to throw the ball a lot. They're going to be fast paced. So I'm a little more intrigued on who's going to be kind of the guy in Kansas City. And I think this could very much be a wide receiver by committee situation, because nobody wants to admit it, but like Mecole Hardman is still probably going to be a thing for this team. I know we've kind of left him completely dead in fantasy, but I've still got him at wide receiver 68. I mean, that's not crazy, but that's relevant, And I'll say this: the one guy I don't want to take is MVS, I just don't buy into the idea that he's going to be, I don't buy into the idea that Marquez Valdes-Scantling suddenly going to be like a target hog. I think he's really good in his role, and that's an important role, which is go down the field and win deep passes. That could be great in Kansas City. I just don't see him taking that other step. The two guys I'm really interested in is Juju and Sky Moore. Starting with Juju, like I think you could squint at Juju and think like he could be this year's Cooper Kupp. And I know that sounds outlandish, and let me tell you, I don't think Juju's going to lead the league in receiving yards and catches and touchdowns. But like he's a mid-round receiver that has a pedigree. Cooper Kupp had a pedigree too. Let me tell you, nobody this time last year was putting Cooper Kupp on like top 10 receivers in the NFL list, but he was a guy that we all agreed was pretty good. Then he sees a dramatic quarterback upgrade going from Jared Goff to Matthew Stafford. I think you could argue that Juju is about to get an even bigger quarterback upgrade going from the husk of Ben Roethlisberger to, freaking Patrick Mahomes. And, obviously Juju got usurped by a guy like Deontay Johnson, who, is just a better receiver than him. But Robert Woods was out targeting Cooper Kupp before this past year too. So again, just similar situations there. And Juju, I think going to play that like big slot receiver role. If he does, I think that's a good fit, but still guy who's declined over the last few years. I don't think he's like a superstar or anything like that. He was only given a 1-year deal. I'm fine drafting Juju where he's going as long as he stays, in like the mid to low 20s as a wide receiver pick. I think he's fine there. I want to, of course, follow camp reports and everything. And then Sky Moore, man, I love Sky Moore. Number 2 in success rate versus man and press coverage among the prospects sampled for reception perception. Of course, playing at a lower level of competition, we know that. But still, maybe he's like an Amon-Ra St. Brown type of guy, not to the same degree, but doesn't do much in the first few weeks, but crushes it in the second half of the season. So just really want to follow camp reports on how this wide receiver rotation is going, but I'm more interested in figuring out the Kansas City puzzle than I am in, whatever's going on in Green Bay.
Nice.
Perfect. So you've released your positional rankings just yesterday, I guess. And 2 players have caught our attention. The first one is Stefan Diggs, and the second one is Allen Robinson. So both really good ones.
No shock.
Yeah.
If you're longtime followers of RP, no shock. No shock there.
So the first in the same tier as our most consensus top 3, because it's really difficult to put Diggs outside the top 3. Formed by Kupp, Jefferson, and Chase. So we have this 3, and then the fourth, the Diggs. The one is well credited as wide receiver 2, as he ranked as wide receiver 18 overall. Can you please tell us what do you see Diggs a tier above guys like Evans, Lamb, and Adams? Like you said before, Adams, the whole situation, as maybe the clear favorite to overcome the aforementioned top 3, and if you totally disregard the letdown that was a Rob last season as a Bear.
Yeah, I think let's start with Stefan Diggs, because I think he has wide receiver 1 overall in his range of outcomes. Obviously, I'm not ranking him there. I'm not projecting for that, but we just talked about like Gabe Davis, potentially stepping up as a number 2 receiver. They're turning over the slot receiver position to some combination of maybe all Jamison Crowder, or maybe it is a combination of him and Isaiah McKenzie. Dawson Knox is coming into kind of his second year as the starter. They're trying to break in a new pass catching back in James Cook. The one thing that's constant, Steph Diggs is the number 1 receiver who's had over 160 targets over the last 2 years. Still, in my mind, the best route runner in the NFL. I think it's him and Devontae Adams, clear cut for that honor. He still owns the number 1 success rate versus man coverage score in reception perception. So he's a legit star in a great situation. We expect the Bills to be this great offense, and he is the best receiver in this offense by a country mile. So I think that Diggs just profiles out so well this year, and I think his efficiency could kind of come somewhere in the middle of that huge 2020 season, and then a little bit of like a lower catch rate, yards per reception sort of stuff in this past year. So really like Diggs. I think he could have a massive season this year. I think he belongs in that first tier of receivers, and he's a guy to me, like once Kupp, Jefferson and Chase get off the board, Diggs is the immediate guy I turn to before that teardrop comes in. Allen Robinson, a little more complicated, sort of, right? Because he has a terrible year last year, as you mentioned. I think that was sort of everything that could go wrong did go wrong for Allen Robinson last year. You've got Matt Nagy having him run a bunch of slants and curls. You've got Justin Fields kind of breaking in the middle of the season. And then he has Robinson's hurt. He has COVID. He's pissed off. They don't give him a contract. So I'm just willing to kind of write off last year. And obviously, I'd love for you guys to trust my evaluation on Allen Robinson, which is that he was still pretty good last year on an individual route by route basis against man and press coverage. But you don't even have to trust me. You could trust the Rams, who have nailed every pro receiver evaluation that they've had. You know, they traded for Sammy Watkins at one point in time, and he scored 8 touchdowns in their X receiver position. They traded for Brandon Cooks, and like I said, he was kind of that finishing piece on the Super Bowl roster in 2018. And then they were outright clowned for Robert Woods, that contract, and he was a productive player for them for a long, long time. And then, of course, you know, amid all of these questions about, can Odell Beckham still do it? Blah, blah, blah. You know, he comes in and is like they don't get to the Super Bowl without Odell Beckham being that X receiver that opened things up for them on the backside. So the Rams have really nailed this thing all the way. I'm willing to trust RP. I'm willing to trust the Rams. And I talked about Gabe Davis. He would have to be really, really bad to fail in this situation. This is going to be tough for Allen Robinson to fail in this situation because he's the clear-cut number 2 passing option on a team that throws the ball a lot, throws the ball near the goal line, and it is playing in an X receiver position for the Rams that has been really, really crucial for them ever since Sean McVay got there.
Yeah, as a Bear fan who drafted Allen Robinson a lot last year, I was a bit bitter with him, but now I'm fully convinced. I'm back on the...
Hey, I drafted a lot of Allen. This is the thing, too. When I put my rankings out there and, I'm higher than consensus on somebody, that means I drafted them a lot. I drafted a lot of Allen Robinson last year, so I feel you. It was bad. It was really bad.
It really was. But now he's in a perfect situation. You mentioned OBJ. He was probably going to be the Super Bowl MVP instead of Cooper Kupp if he didn't get hurt. So, yeah, we have to take a look at RP that shows that Robinson is not washed, and now it's in a perfect situation. So we're curious to know, Matt, what you think about the Washington Commanders offense. One that is getting an upgrade at the quarterback position, although with Carson Wentz, but it is an upgrade.
It is an upgrade. Yeah. You can't
complain.
Yeah. Even if you got to say it through gritted teeth, because we talked about Allen Robinson. For years with the Bears, I had gone, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but we had for years gone, or at least me, I had for years gone, Nick Foles is the best quarterback Allen Robinson's ever played with. Andy Dalton will be the best quarterback Allen Robinson has ever played with. It's you can kind of say through gritted teeth, Carson Wentz is the best quarterback Terry McLaurin has ever played with, which is that's where we're at.
Yeah. It's just tough. Yeah. And the Commanders also added a round 1 receiver and a round 3 runner to a running back room that already had extended its pass catching specialists and sees the return of Curtis Samuel, a player that you seem to like well above the consensus as well. Aside from that, they have a veteran tight end coming back from multiple ligament tears and a second-year tight end in John Bates. We also know you view Terry McLaurin as one of the best at his position, ranking him just outside of wide receiver 1 territory. But how do you see all the pieces in this intriguing unit? Do you worry about them with all these mouths to feed?
Yeah, I think Washington could be pretty fun this year if Carson Wentz can just be average. The problem is Carson Wentz is who he is. I mean, they got everything you hear out of Indianapolis, Zach Kiefer for The Athletic and a lot of others have written about it. They talked about it. They just could not wait to get Carson Wentz out of there. And it wasn't even just a ownership situation. I mean, clearly Jim Irsay was freaking done with Carson Wentz and was not having him back as the quarterback. But even the coaching staff started to get tired of the fact that he was so hard to coach, and he was always could never just play within the structure of the offense, but would always kind of try to make that hero play that was just not necessary in that situation. So I don't know how much faith I want to have in Carson Wentz, but I love the weapons there. I love the pass catchers assembled there. You mentioned Terry McLaurin. I feel the same way about Terry McLaurin as I did with Stephon Diggs back in 2017, 2018, which just man, this guy is such a good separator and can win in contested situations. He's a true number one receiver. If we just ever got him to the right situation, he would explode. Obviously, that happened for Diggs. We're not quite there yet with Terry McLaurin. We'll see what happens. But beyond him, Curtis Samuel, I think, is still underrated because he didn't play much last year because he was banged up the entire season. So he's still an important player for them on an important contract. Johan Dotson, people made fun of that draft pick because it was higher than expected, but I really like Johan Dotson. He can get open against zone coverage. Reminds me a lot of a Doug Baldwin type of receiver with really good hands. And we'll see what happens with Logan Thomas, the pride of Lynchburg, Virginia, man. He's come back from a serious injury, but there's just a lot of talent on this offense that I think is a little underrated. If the offensive line, which is a question mark, but if the offensive line could play pretty well, I like Scott Turner as a play caller because he plays pretty fast with a lot of tempo and wants to throw the ball. Taylor Heineke just really limited. And again, no shot to my guy, the ODU's finest, Taylor Heineke, but just can't push the ball down the field, really limits the offense overall. So I don't know. We'll see what happens, but I do really like the weapons on this team. That's for sure.
Nice. So let's start wrapping things up here. Derek, do you have one last question or more than one? And just,
yes, I have to.
Thank you very much for being here. Just leave your best regards to our great guest.
So my last two questions are regarding two offenses that changed the quarterback. The first one is the Panthers with Baker Mayfield. And the second one is regarding the Steelers with Kenny Pickett or Trubisky. What are your thoughts in these two offenses and their wide receivers? What do you project them? Do you like the most? What do you like the most? What do you hate the most regarding that?
Well, I hate everything about the Panthers, but we'll come back to them. The Steelers, I think, are interesting because talk about a quarterback that limited what you could do. Ben Roethlisberger he has to dictate the offense because at this point in his football playing, he's retired now, obviously, but the last couple of years, can't move anymore, doesn't want to get hit, can't throw the ball down the field. That is just a 3-level checklist of just completely limits what you can do. And Matt Canada, the offensive coordinator last year, the quarterback coach year before that, he's a guy who loves to play with motion. He loves to get his quarterback on the move. Obviously, we see that with Pickett and Mitch Trubisky even too. These guys can move around a lot. That's going to open things up in a certain way. Hopefully opens up the downfield passing game, gets a guy like Deontay Johnson some downfield routes. I love Deontay Johnson. I'm a big fan. I think he could be kind of a guy that gets slept on a little bit this year with the quarterback change. Sure, Deontay Johnson's not going to get 160 pop gun targets or whatever, but if we get him some targets actually down the field, that would be great. So I think the Steelers' offensive line is just a huge concern. We got to see who's going to step up at the number 2 receiver position. Chase Claypool had a great rookie year, but was really terrible from an individual perspective last year. So, is he going to get jumped by a guy like George Pickens or something like that? I don't know. There's just a lot of turnover in the Steelers wide receiver room beyond Deontay Johnson, but I do think there's some nice young pieces there. And I think the quarterback change, even if we don't love Trubisky, even if Kenny Pickett's not ready to play week 1, which is a little strange because I feel like you kind of want to draft him as a pro ready guy, but I don't know, whatever. I think there's a chance that quarterback situation could be better than what the Ben Roethlisberger led Steelers have been doing the last few years. And then the Panthers, this is another one where I don't know if it's as much gritted teeth as we've talked about with this other guy, but Baker Mayfield is definitely the best quarterback DJ Moore has ever played with because he unfortunately kind of missed the last good years of Cam Newton because Newton got hurt. But he was playing with the ghost of Cam Newton at certain points, Sam Darnold. I mean, Teddy Bridgewater's pretty fine, but I think Baker can be an average starter for Carolina if all other things are good. I think he's not like Sam Darnold where, as soon as the train goes off Darnold just isn't good. He's just not a good quarterback. There's no excuses really at this point left for Sam. Baker needs the right situation to be okay, but I do think that this is good news for DJ Moore, who I bumped up to wide receiver 11 in my rankings. I think DJ Moore could quietly have a really big year with Baker Mayfield. If Mayfield, I think Mayfield starts week 1. I think he starts the whole season. Not the biggest Mayfield fan. I don't think he's like the franchise answer there for Carolina or whatever, but I do think he's good news for the pass catchers there.
Nice, Matt. So we just have one last question that comes from our editor-in-chief, Rui Mauricio. He asks you about your colleagues at Yahoo. The Yahoo Fantasy Forecast has an incredible cast: Andy Behrens, Scott Pianowski, Liz Loza, Dalton Del Don, and yourself, obviously. How nice it is to work with such a passionate and smart guys in the business, and what aspects could you point out of each of them?
I will just say I'll loop everybody in together that I think the good part about working with them is that everybody kind of approaches the game a little bit differently. And I think that makes for, sometimes that can be challenging with like you're making a podcast together and like we all host the show and it's like that rotating cast of characters. But I think about football really differently than like Scott thinks about football or Dalton thinks about football. But that's great when you get on a show with somebody and you're able to sort of challenge each other. Scott has like this unbelievable memory of things that happened like before I was born. So I think the cool part about everybody is, we just all see the game really differently from each other. And that makes for, I think it makes for good content. I think it makes for a fun experience because I learn a lot, from everybody. And I think it's hopefully good for the listener that hopefully if you, maybe there's one of us that you trust more than the other. I mean, maybe not, but you could pick kind of like, I just like the way that Andy or Liz thinks about football or talks about players, but I also like when their opinion is challenged by me or Dalton or something like that. I think that's good. I think that's good overall for football content because we know the game is so volatile and hard to predict. We're not going to get everything right, but I think as a collective, hopefully we challenge listeners on how they think about the game and the way we approach things.
Yeah, you definitely do. And it's a great show that we listen very, very often. So, Matt, thank you so very much for being here with us for a second year in a row. We hope to have you again next year. And it's always such a masterclass that you give us. And Brasil Fantasy Football, the whole community here really looks up to you. And, well, thank you once again, man.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate you having me. It's always fun to jump on. And shout out to everybody over there in Brazil. Hope you guys are living well and everything. And just this is going to be a fun season, I think, for all of us. I think it's going to be really interesting with all of this player movement. So it's fun to discuss with y'all in the off season. It's going to be even more fun to see the results when kickoff actually comes, which is so close. It's unbelievably close. It feels almost too close sometimes. So I thank you guys for the opportunity to come on here and talk about it with you.
Yeah, here in Brazil, we have the main broadcaster who has a saying that goes something like, September always arrives. So it's coming. Yes. It's coming.
It is coming, man. It is.
Okay, Matt, thank you very much. Derek, muito obrigado, meu grande amigo. Se quiser deixar seu último recado também para a galera, valeu demais, viu?
Bem, muito obrigado, pessoal, por ter acompanhado até aqui. Não se esqueça de, novamente, deixar o like, compartilhar o vídeo, ir lá no nosso Twitter, falar como foi, o que vocês acharam também. E, obviamente, thank you very much, Matt, for having accepted our invite twice in a row. So we're hoping that you accept the third time next year. And also, for anyone that by any chance live in a cave, where can we find you? Where can we find your content? And please feel free to tell us everything.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at @MattHarmon_BYB. You were great to mention the Yahoo Fantasy Football Forecast, which is, of course, our podcast. Please, check it out. Would love you to do that. And receptionperception.com is the home for all of my rankings, my tiers, stuff like that we discussed. But, of course, I've got over 50 NFL receivers and over a ton of college prospects charted as well. So if you want evaluations on those guys, definitely check it out over there. Sortable data, everything like that. I think if you check it out, you'll really love it. receptionperception.com.
Boa. É isso aí, galera. Muito obrigado a todo mundo que participou aí no chat, que vai nos assistir no futuro. Brasil Fantasy Football sempre trazendo os melhores conteúdos sobre o assunto aqui no Brasil. É isso aí, até a próxima. Um grande abraço.